This is Speaking of Speaking. Quick tips and tools to take you from stage fright to spotlight. This podcast gives you an inside look from the world of public speaking and the speaking secrets you need to be bold from the stage, no matter what business you're in. The host of Speaking, Carl Richards.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, it is another edition of the Speaking of Speaking podcast. I'm so glad that you've decided to join us today. Thanks for all of your support over the last few years that I've been doing this podcast. We're going to talk about authenticity in your message today. But before I do that, I wanted to just let you know a couple of announcements. Number one is that starting shortly, there will be a fan community for you to participate in. It's probably going to be Patreon, so I'll invite you to participate in that now. Some of the advantages of being a member of the fan community will be access to such things as exclusive content. So there'll be additional content that won't be a part of the podcast, but you'll be able to have access to. Also, merchandise, whether they be t-shirts, hats, pens, all sorts of other things, you'll have access to those as well. If you're a business person and you like the thought of being able to have somebody promote your business for you, then you'll like this. I will be doing shout outs to some of my largest fans who are in the Patreon community, as well as you'll have access to books, also access to front row access to events and other happenings as well above and beyond the podcast. So that'll be coming probably in the next couple of weeks. So watch for that. And I encourage you to play at any level you want, but certainly if you want access to the exclusive content or merchandise or any of the books that I've had the opportunity to be a part of, then certainly I would suggest the highest tier. And usually on Patreon, the highest tier is around $25 or something like that. So just keep an eye out for that. I also wanted to let you know that I will be starting a second podcast in the coming months, and it'll be a little bit different from this one, but also there will be some overlapping information. So as you may know, I took the leap from being in broadcasting and doing speaker training and went full bore into doing podcast training as well as podcast support and technical production and things like that. So the second podcast will be dedicated solely to the podcasting world. What'll it be about? We're still putting the finishing touches on it, but you can expect there to be a lot of information regarding how to set up your podcast, for example. What are some of the things that you need to consider before you hit go and publish your podcast? What are some of the things you need to know as far as, how to conduct an interview or how to create your content? What things should you be looking for as far as music goes or artwork selection, title selection, all of those things? That'll be what the podcast will be about. We will have guests from time to time who are experts in the podcasting world or have some other type of expertise that does complement quite nicely. It'll be a lot of information, though, to support you in your podcast journey. Who knows? Maybe you'll be a guest. So keep a close eye and ear out for that, and I'll certainly let you know in this community when that podcast is ready to launch. So today I wanted to talk about something that is, I've talked about this before, but very loosely, and I want to revisit it because of something that's come across my desk recently. So I want to talk about authenticity in your messaging. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because I made a mistake, a huge error in judgment, and it certainly wasn't intended to harm anyone or have anyone second guess my ability to come up with my own creative thoughts and ideas. But one of the things that I did was I took a page from one of my mentors, person who's given me a lot of coaching along the way throughout the last, several years. His name is Steve Lowell. He is a very, very respected thought leader in the area of communication and speaking. As a matter of fact, he was a guest of mine back not that long ago. It took me a long time to bring Steve to my show, and I was very blessed to have him as a guest on my show. And a lot of what we talked about was, first and foremost was about messaging and speaking and communication. And I've learned a ton from him. And the error that I made, and I didn't even realize I was making this mistake, and it happens all the time, by the way. So I'm not saying that, or I'm not trying to sidestep and say I didn't make a mistake or say that, or brush it off as, well, it's a mistake. But, everyone does it, so what's the harm in it? But one of the things that I was inadvertently doing, not even knowing I was doing it, but I was mimicking some of the things that Steve has been talking about for years. Though I wasn't using his intellectual property, I was certainly very close to the point where what I was passing off as being mine was not exactly mine to begin with. It was a fabrication or a close facsimile to something that has been either his intellectual property or his messaging over the years. And when Steve pointed that out to me, it was a little bit of a shock, firstly, to hear from Steve, you're doing this. But then it really made me think, well, how many other people are doing that, not knowing that they're doing it, but also not knowing how it could be harming them and their level of professionalism. And then I started to think, well, has this ever been done to me? And how would I feel if somebody was using some of my material or some of the things that I have shared over the years? And how would I feel if they were passing it off as theirs? And then I realized that for certain things, if somebody shares a template with you and they say, hey, go ahead, use that template till forever and a day, that's okay. But if you're using somebody else's models or messaging and saying, hey, this is mine, even though it really isn't yours, it's similar messaging to what your coach has shared with you or somebody else that you respect, be it, a thought leader or somebody that maybe it's a coach that you follow or a thought leader of a book that you've read, something like that. You really have to be careful. And how it can affect you is, let's just say it can affect you in several ways, especially if you and the person who you are mimicking, let's use that term, because I wasn't copying Steve verbatim. I was more or less mimicking or making some of what he has created over the years, altering it slightly to make it seem like it's something original and that I could call my own. And you have to be careful when you do that, especially when you talk about branding or logos and things like that. But how would I react if it was me? And I thought, I would probably react the same way Steve did and let people know that, it's really affecting you, or it can be. So I was very pleased that Steve pointed that out to me. And it was a tough lesson to learn because I've worked so hard over the years, just like Steve has, to be different and to stand out. Not knowing that not only was I not being as different as I thought I was, but in an effort to try and stand out and stand up, I was not doing that. I was copying somebody else, not knowing I was copying them. Was it a complete plagiarization of Steve's work? No. Does it happen where sometimes you'll do that? Absolutely. As a matter of fact, in the world I come from, the world of radio and television and conventional media, it happens all the time. And if you're in the conventional world of media, you know some of the ways it happens. It happens in the reporting of news, where you'll either use a story or you'll rewrite a news story and put your signature to it. You might also work for an organization or a radio station, for example, that has a moniker that sounds like another radio station, for example. And I don't know how many times these words get used a lot. Today's best this, whether it be today's best music, today's best rock, today's best country. Is it really yours to own? Is it a reflection of who you really are or what your company is if you're using it just the way another company is using it? And that's the world that I spent 25 years in, not realizing that, oh my goodness, we sound just like every other radio station that says today's best music. And today's best music, you know what? All of those radio stations tend to sound very similar. So what does that mean for you as a speaker? Or how can you make sure that your messaging is authentic? Well, I want to walk through some scenarios here, and I want to ask you some questions, because I had to ask myself these questions when Steve was pointing out some of the things that I had done. Ask yourself this question: is this messaging, or is this model, is it really yours? And if you can say, well, yes, it is mine, take another look at it. Take a look at your messaging and ask yourself, how much of it is yours? Is it all yours? Or is some of it something that you've borrowed from somebody else? Here's what I know. If it's something that you've borrowed from somebody else, something that you've learned, be it a model or a format or some type of a tool, what you should be doing is saying something like, and it's as simple as saying, one of my coaches, Steve Lowell, has shared this model with me, and I want to share with you what it is and what it means. What that's doing is giving credit to Steve in this case. So if I had said something like, my coach quite often says this, or I've heard my coach say this, or my coach, Steve Lowell, who's a very respected speaker in the world of public speaking, has said this. If I said that, didn't just pass it off as mine. If I said that, that would save my bacon. Or if I said, this model is an example of something that Steve teaches all the time. And by the way, you should check his material out. And by the way, we will put the links to Steve's information for those of you who are interested in the type of work that Steve does. We're going to put that in the show notes so you can check out Steve. Ask yourself, is it yours? How much of it is yours? And then go back to coaches that you've had over the years and ask yourself, have I learned anything from those coaches? Have I taken any of those things and inadvertently started to call them mine? In other words, are you using material that really isn't yours, but passing it off as yours? Are you quoting sources? Are you double checking to make sure that all of the people whose information you're using is being properly credited? Whether it be quotes, whether it be, as I said, models, whether it be certain words and phrases, whatever it is, are you giving credit where the credit is due? Because I know, having worked hard for the last 25 years in radio and now doing podcasting and helping people launch podcasts and maintain their podcasts, I've worked hard. The reason why people move up the ladder and acquire such things as their own intellectual property is because of hard work. It's because of doing a lot of soul searching, maybe even writing some books, and really thinking about what it is that makes them unique. And that's why it's their own intellectual property. And everyone has, well, not everyone, but certainly a lot of coaches, consultants, thought leaders, world-class trainers, they all have intellectual property. So in order for you to be clear and authentic with your messaging, if you are using any quotes or any messaging that's not yours, you need to give credit. You need to be able to say, yes, my coach Steve Lowell taught me this. Or yes, I learned this from so-and-so. One of the things that I share all the time is one of the people who I've seen speak a couple of times, his name is Mike Lipkin, and I'll say, Mike Lipkin once said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And I don't know if Mike Lipkin is the only person who said it, but I quote the person who I've heard it from. I want you to think about your messaging and ask yourself, is my messaging really authentic? Is it really me? Is it genuine? Is it sincere? And is it mine? It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's wording for a website, whether it's a signature talk, whether it's a podcast even. Check and make sure that the wording that you're using, that the messaging you are imparting with your audience is truly yours. And if you're not sure, ask. I've already made it my mission to, as I'm building a new website and starting a new podcast, that if there's anything there that I think is an infringement, for example, on Steve's work, I'm going to ask him. I'm going to say, hey, Steve, I'm just putting this together for my new website. Can you have a quick look at it? And just, I don't necessarily need his full assessment, but I need him to say, yep, no, that's fine the way it is. It's nothing that I would say, or certainly not the way I would say it. So, because it's important to ask the question. It's also important to, if you make a mistake, because we all do. And as Steve pointed out, a lot of people do the copycat thing, or they mimic, or they take a little piece of this and a little piece of this and morph it together and call it their own, even though it might not be their own. But the important thing is if it's pointed out to you that, hey, that's mine, or it looks a lot like mine, is to apologize. Just simply say, hey, you know what? I didn't realize I was doing that. Especially if you genuinely didn't realize you were doing it, like what happened with me. And I didn't realize that some of what I was sharing with people was not a complete ripoff, but it was certainly a copycat or a mimicking of some of the things that Steve has taught me over the years. Apology is, it needs to be sincere. I don't think I need to hammer that point home, but, you need to be sincere and genuine and not flip and not snarky and not say, well, sorry. That just is not the right messaging that you want to impart on people. You want to be able to say, hey, man, look, I'm really sorry. Was not meant to do that at all. And then maybe even say what you're going to do to fix it. Say, are you going to take down any messaging that is not yours? Or reword something? Or in my case, I've already said to Steve that as I build my new website, that it's going to have certain messaging that I've had to edit. I've already said to Steve that as I rebuild my website, that the messaging will not use certain words and phrases together that he uses all the time. So that's the big thing. And the other thing too is to always be aware. You don't want to get into a situation where you are using something that isn't yours, and then you get caught in a legal battle with somebody who does own something, that somebody has actually put a trademark or a copyright on their intellectual property. It can be a very costly, expensive mistake. So be aware of that. Okay. So your messaging should be authentic, meaning it should be yours. Anything that's not you should be quoted. The source should be quoted. If it's a coach or a thought leader, especially one that you're close to, that could be, you could have shared communities that you both speak in. You should be definitely saying something that is crediting your coach or the person that you got that information from. Or better yet, it's better to stay clear of that and think up your own, what is it that makes you unique? What is it that makes you the authentic version of yourself? What is it that makes your messaging yours, your stories, your, the way in which you frame things, the way in which you phrase your sentences, the wording, that all becomes very important. Okay, so I wanted to share this, and I hope it's been helpful. And you'd be surprised after recording this episode, even before recording this episode, and looking at certain websites, social media posts, all kinds of things, how much inauthenticity there really is. And in order to stand above the crowd, in order to be seen as a truly authentic individual, I think you need to separate yourself from what everyone else is doing. And you need to be yourself. And you do that by not copying, mimicking, or doing anything that is possibly putting yourself and your branding in harm's way by making it look like somebody else's. I hope this has been helpful today. If you ever have a question, don't hesitate to reach out. It's askcarl@carlspeaks.ca. And until next time, remember, get out there and own the platform.
Thanks for listening to the Speaking of Speaking podcast. Fired up about something you heard today? Want to learn more? Be sure to visit carlspeaks.ca. And don't forget to follow Carl on Twitter @CarlRichard72 or join the Facebook group Speaking of Speaking.